Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I need to speak with you today because something has changed quietly in recent weeks, something that most people still cannot see, but which will determine whether you navigate the next 2 years as observers or as victims. We are talking about what has begun to be called behind closed doors, Reset 2.0, and unlike what happened between 2020 and 2021, this time it is not just about economic recovery, it is about replacement. While everyone debates inflation and interest rates, while everyone watches markets rise and fall, a completely new infrastructure is being installed beneath everything we know as money, as debt, as financial control. And 2026 is not just a date on the calendar, it is when this transition becomes irreversible. When central banks around the world started coordinating their digital currency timelines in ways they had never done before, most people assumed it was just another technological upgrade, another step toward a more efficient payment system. But what almost no one realized was that this coordination was not about efficiency, it was about synchronization. By late 2025, more than 70 countries had moved beyond research into active pilot programs for central bank digital currencies. The timing was no accident. Russia announced that its largest banks would enable digital ruble transactions. By September 2026, Brazil confirmed its Drex launch for the same year in 2 phases. And the European Central Bank completed its preparation phase for the digital euro, setting the stage for legislation in 2026, with pilots beginning in 2027. This was not a series of independent decisions by sovereign nations. This was orchestration. The Bank for International Settlements, often called the Central Bank of Central Banks, had been quietly facilitating this coordination through initiatives like Project Agora, connecting major central banks in ways that would make simultaneous implementation not just possible, but inevitable. What made this different from previous monetary experiments was the scope and the permanence. Unlike quantitative easing or interest rate adjustments that could be reversed, digital currencies represented a fundamental infrastructure change that would be nearly impossible to undo once implemented. The architecture being built was designed to replace, not supplement, the existing monetary system. While financial media focused on the technical capabilities of these new digital systems, what they missed was the control infrastructure being embedded within them. Every transaction would be visible, every account could be monitored, and most importantly, every unit of digital currency could be programmed with conditions that traditional cash never had. Spending limits, expiration dates, geographic restrictions, and social credit integrations were all technically feasible and already being tested in various pilot programs. The People's Bank of China had demonstrated this with over 800 million digital yuan wallets and more than 10 trillion yuan in transactions, proving that mass adoption was not just possible but could be achieved within a remarkably short time frame. The pattern was becoming clear to those who were paying attention, but the implications were still largely invisible to the general public, who continued to view these developments as technological progress rather than monetary revolution. The transition from optional to mandatory was always going to be the critical moment, and by 2026, the mechanisms for that transition were already in place. What made this shift particularly dangerous was that it would not happen through dramatic announcements or obvious policy changes. Instead, it would unfold through a series of seemingly reasonable responses to manufactured crises that would make digital currencies appear to be the only rational solution. The infrastructure for this transition had been quietly constructed through a web of regulatory frameworks that most people never noticed. The Clarity Act in the United States provided the legal foundation for distinguishing between traditional money and digital assets, while the markets in crypto assets. Regulation in Europe created the compliance structure necessary for mass adoption. These were not just regulatory frameworks, they were the legal architecture for a monetary system that could be activated whenever the circumstances required it. The genius of this approach was that it created urgency without appearing deliberate. When traditional banking systems began experiencing liquidity problems, when cash became increasingly impractical for daily transactions, when cyber attacks targeted conventional payment networks, digital currencies would be presented as the immediate and obvious fix. The timing was particularly significant because it coincided with a broader financial environment that was becoming increasingly unstable. Interest rates that had been suppressed for over a decade were now rising rapidly. Debt levels had reached unprecedented proportions, and the traditional tools that central banks had used to manage previous crises were no longer effective. In this context, digital currencies offered something that traditional monetary policy could not: direct control over the velocity and direction of money flow throughout the entire economy. Unlike printing money and hoping it would reach the right places, digital currencies could be programmed to ensure that spending happened exactly where policymakers wanted it to happen. And this was not just about making payments more efficient, it was about making the entire economy more controllable. The implications extended far beyond monetary policy into areas that had traditionally been considered private. Consumer behavior, political donations, business relationships, travel patterns, and even personal associations could all be monitored and influenced through the proper application of programmable money restrictions. Now, what was being marketed as financial innovation was actually the infrastructure for a level of economic surveillance and control that had never been possible in human history. The transition would be gradual enough that most people would adjust to each new restriction as it was implemented, but comprehensive enough that by the time the full system was operational, traditional alternatives would no longer exist. While everyone was watching central banks prepare their digital currencies, the real trap was being constructed in the bond markets, and it was designed to spring exactly when the new monetary system needed a crisis to justify its emergency implementation. The mathematics of this trap were elegant in their simplicity, but devastating in their implications. For more than a decade, government debt had grown faster than the economies that were supposed to support it, but low interest rates had made this seem manageable. Now, with rates rising and debt burdens approaching critical levels, the cost of servicing existing obligations was consuming an ever-increasing share of government resources, leaving less room for the kind of spending that could stimulate growth and provide political benefits. This was not an accident. The timing of interest rate increases and the coordination of monetary policy changes across major economies suggested a level of planning that went far beyond normal central bank cooperation. The Federal Reserve had been reducing its securities holdings while raising rates rapidly since 2022, draining liquidity from the financial system in a way that made markets increasingly fragile. Other major central banks had been following similar patterns, creating a global environment where even small shocks could trigger massive disruptions. The vulnerability was particularly acute in the corporate debt markets, where companies had borrowed heavily during the low-rate environment and were now facing refinancing challenges that many would not survive. Investment-grade corporate debt had reached levels that would have been considered reckless in previous decades, but the gradual nature of the increase had made it seem normal. Now, as interest costs spiked and credit conditions tightened, a wave of defaults was becoming inevitable. The timing of this crisis was crucial because it would occur just as the new digital currency infrastructure was ready for deployment. Traditional monetary tools would prove inadequate for addressing a crisis that involved both sovereign debt problems and corporate insolvency on a scale that dwarfed previous recessions. In this environment, the ability to directly control money flow through programmable digital currencies would appear to be the only viable solution. The trap was not just financial, but psychological. By the time the crisis reached its peak, the public would be desperate for any solution that promised stability and security, making them willing to accept restrictions and monitoring that they would have rejected under normal circumstances. The beauty of this approach was that it would appear to be a rescue rather than a takeover, a necessary response to an emergency rather than the implementation of a long-planned transformation. The comparison to 2008 was not just about the scale of the potential crisis, but about the fundamental difference in how the global financial system would respond when traditional rescue mechanisms no longer worked. In 2008, central banks could still print money with confidence that it would eventually find its way into the economy through the banking system. They could lower interest rates to near zero and purchase massive quantities of government bonds to provide liquidity and stability. Most importantly, they could do all of this while maintaining the basic structure of the monetary system that people understood and trusted. But by 2026, every one of these tools had been exhausted or compromised. Interest rates had already been near zero for so long that further reductions would have minimal impact. Central bank balance sheets had expanded to levels that made additional quantitative easing potentially destabilizing rather than stabilizing. The banking system itself had become so dependent on central bank support that any reduction in that support threatened to trigger the very crisis that policymakers were trying to avoid. What made the situation particularly dangerous was that the underlying debt dynamics had become mathematically unsolvable through traditional means. Ray Dalio's analysis of the debt supercycle suggested that the United States and other major economies had reached a point where debt growth consistently outpaced economic growth, creating a compound effect that would accelerate until something fundamental changed. The U.S. national debt had crossed $37 trillion and was growing at a rate that would require increasingly aggressive measures to maintain confidence in government obligations. But unlike previous debt crises, this one was occurring in an environment where all the major economies faced similar problems simultaneously. There was no external source of capital that could provide the kind of rescue that had been possible in previous decades. China, which had served as a stabilizing force during the 2008 crisis, was dealing with its own debt problems and had already begun reducing its holdings of U.S. Treasury securities. European governments were struggling with similar debt dynamics while also managing the political instability that came with persistent economic stagnation and rising populist movements. The interconnectedness of the global financial system, which had grown dramatically since 2008, meant that a crisis in any major economy would immediately spread to all others through derivatives markets, currency relationships, and trade dependencies. The derivatives market alone represented notional values that exceeded global GDP by factors that made the system inherently unstable. When something this complex and highly leveraged begins to unravel, traditional policy responses become not just inadequate, but potentially counterproductive. The speed at which modern financial markets operate, combined with algorithmic trading and automated systems, meant that a crisis could develop and reach critical levels within hours, rather than the days or weeks that policymakers had to respond in previous crises. This compression of time frames eliminated the possibility of the kind of coordinated international response that had been effective in previous decades. In this environment, the ability to implement emergency monetary measures instantaneously through digital currency systems would not just be attractive, but would appear to be the only option available. The infrastructure that was being put in place under the banner of financial innovation was actually the emergency response system for a crisis that was already baked into the mathematics of the global debt structure. The reset that was being planned was not a response to unforeseen circumstances, but a controlled transition from a system that was already failing to one that could be managed through direct digital intervention. The debt ceiling had always been a political weapon, but by 2026, it would become the trigger mechanism for the most significant monetary transformation in modern history. The mathematical reality was becoming impossible to ignore. Even with the $5 trillion increase that had been enacted through the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the United States would exhaust this increase within approximately 2 years at current spending levels. This was not a matter of political preference or economic theory, it was arithmetic. The federal government was spending approximately 6% more than it collected in revenue, creating a deficit that required constant borrowing to maintain basic operations. When the debt ceiling became binding again, the Treasury would face an impossible choice between defaulting on existing obligations or cutting spending by amounts that would trigger an immediate economic collapse. The conventional analysis suggested that Congress would eventually reach a compromise, as it had in previous debt ceiling crises. But this analysis missed several crucial factors that made 2026 fundamentally different. The political environment had become so polarized that compromise was no longer a reliable mechanism for resolving fiscal disputes. The economic environment had become so fragile that even the threat of default could trigger the kind of market disruption that would force immediate action rather than allowing time for negotiation. Most importantly, the alternative infrastructure was now ready for deployment in ways that it had not been during previous crises. The Treasury had been quietly developing protocols for managing federal payments through digital systems that could bypass traditional banking channels if necessary. The Federal Reserve had been testing direct payment mechanisms that could ensure continuity of government operations, even if conventional bond markets became dysfunctional. These were not just contingency plans. They were the foundation for a new monetary system that could be activated through emergency authorities if traditional debt financing became impossible. The legal framework for this transition already existed through various emergency powers that had never been fully tested but provided broad authority for financial system intervention during national emergencies. The precedent had been set during the 2020 pandemic when unprecedented monetary and fiscal measures were implemented with minimal legislative oversight. The infrastructure that had been developed for pandemic response could be quickly adapted for debt crisis response, but with modifications that would make the changes permanent rather than temporary. The psychological impact of a debt ceiling crisis would be crucial for public acceptance of these changes. Unlike the gradual implementation that might face resistance, an emergency deployment would be seen as necessary and temporary, even though the technical infrastructure would make reverting to the previous system extremely difficult. The timing was particularly significant because it would coincide with other stresses on the financial system that would make traditional solutions appear inadequate. Corporate debt refinancing problems, rising unemployment, supply chain disruptions, and international monetary instability would create a complex crisis that required complex solutions. In this environment, the comprehensive nature of digital currency systems would appear to be their greatest strength rather than their greatest risk. The ability to monitor and control every transaction would be presented as a necessary tool for preventing fraud, ensuring proper distribution of emergency resources, and maintaining stability during a period of unprecedented uncertainty. What would be implemented as crisis management would become the new normal, not through explicit policy choice, but through the practical impossibility of returning to systems that would appear antiquated and unreliable by comparison. The coordination between central banks had reached a level that went far beyond traditional monetary policy cooperation, and by 2026, they were implementing what could only be described as a unified global strategy, disguised as independent national decisions. The Bank for International Settlements had become the nerve center for this coordination, facilitating not just information sharing, but active synchronization of policy implementation timelines that would ensure maximum impact when the various pieces came together. What made this coordination particularly effective was that it operated through existing institutional frameworks that appeared to be normal central bank cooperation, making it nearly invisible to external observers who were not looking for patterns across multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. The European Central Bank had moved its digital euro project from preparation to implementation phase with a precision that suggested coordination with other major currency initiatives. The timing of legislative approval in 2026, followed by pilot programs in 2027, was designed to align with similar timelines for digital currency deployment in other major economies. This was not coincidence, but careful planning that ensured the new monetary infrastructure would be deployed simultaneously across all major trading relationships, preventing any single country from gaining a competitive advantage through early adoption, while also preventing any country from avoiding participation by maintaining traditional monetary systems. The Federal Reserve had been notably quiet about its own digital dollar plans, but this silence was strategic rather than indicative of inaction. Through Project Agora and other collaborative initiatives, the Fed had been testing wholesale digital currency applications that could be quickly scaled to retail use if circumstances required rapid deployment. The infrastructure was being built to be activation ready rather than announcement ready, allowing for immediate implementation without the lengthy public consultation processes that might generate opposition or resistance. Central bank communication strategies had shifted toward preparing public expectations for monetary system changes without explicitly describing what those changes would entail. References to financial system modernization, payment efficiency improvements, and technological advancement were consistently used to frame digital currency development as inevitable progress rather than policy choice. This linguistic framing was crucial because it made opposition appear to be resistance to technological improvement rather than legitimate concern about monetary sovereignty and privacy rights. The international monetary system was being restructured through a series of bilateral and multilateral agreements that established technical standards and operational protocols for digital currency interoperability. These agreements were presented as trade facilitation and financial efficiency measures, but their actual function was to create a unified global monetary infrastructure that could operate independently of traditional banking systems and existing international financial institutions. The Bank for International Settlements had published guidance promoting unified, identity-linked architectures that would ensure consistency across different national digital currency systems. This standardization was presented as a technical requirement for cross-border functionality, but it actually served to eliminate the possibility of any major economy implementing a digital currency system that preserved the privacy characteristics of physical cash. The identity linking requirement meant that every transaction in the new monetary system would be traceable and potentially subject to analysis and control by authorities in any participating jurisdiction. The timeline for this transition had been carefully calibrated to take advantage of multiple crisis factors that would converge around 2026. Rising debt service costs, corporate refinancing challenges, and potential sovereign debt problems would create an environment where the existing monetary system would appear to be failing, while the new digital infrastructure would appear to offer comprehensive solutions. The central banks were not responding to these crises, but had positioned themselves to take advantage of predictable mathematical problems that had been building for over a decade. Their final hand was not being played in response to unforeseen circumstances, but as the culmination of a long-term strategy that required specific conditions to be successful. The success of this strategy depended on public perception that the changes were necessary responses to external threats, rather than the implementation of a plan that had been developed years in advance. The Great Reset had never disappeared. It had simply evolved beyond public recognition into a series of technical implementations and institutional changes that were achieving the same objectives through less visible means. The World Economic Forum's original initiative, launched in June 2020, had outlined 3 core components that were now being implemented through the digital currency infrastructure and associated regulatory frameworks that most people viewed as separate technical developments rather than coordinated policy implementation. The first component, steering markets toward fairer outcomes, was being accomplished through the programmable nature of digital currencies that could enforce spending patterns, taxation compliance, and resource allocation in ways that traditional monetary policy could never achieve. The second component, ensuring that investments advance shared goals, was being implemented through environmental, social, and governance metrics that were being embedded into financial systems through central bank climate risk assessments and sustainability reporting requirements that would become enforceable through digital transaction monitoring. The third component, harnessing innovations of the fourth industrial revolution, was being realized through the artificial intelligence systems that would manage and analyze the transaction data generated by universal digital currency adoption. What made this implementation particularly effective was that it avoided the political resistance that had emerged when the Great Reset was discussed as an explicit policy agenda. Instead of announcing a comprehensive transformation of the global economic system, the same objectives were being achieved through a series of seemingly independent technical upgrades and regulatory improvements that each appeared reasonable and necessary when considered individually. The stakeholder capitalism model that Klaus Schwab had promoted for decades was being embedded into the operational structure of the new monetary system through public-private partnerships that gave multinational corporations unprecedented influence over policy implementation while maintaining the appearance of government control. The World Economic Forum's strategic partnership with the United Nations, formalized through the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, had created the institutional framework for coordinating these changes across national boundaries through international organizations that operated outside traditional democratic oversight mechanisms. The digital governance systems that had been developed during the pandemic provided the technical infrastructure for implementing comprehensive social and economic monitoring that would have been politically impossible to introduce through normal legislative processes. The contact tracing systems, digital health passports, and emergency payment distribution mechanisms that had been normalized during 2020 and 2021 had established both the technical capabilities and the legal precedents for the kind of comprehensive monitoring and control that the new monetary system would require. The transition was being managed through crisis response rather than policy debate, ensuring that implementation would be driven by apparent necessity rather than political choice. The climate change agenda had been particularly useful for creating the sense of urgency and emergency that justified extraordinary measures and expedited implementation timelines. The argument that climate catastrophe required immediate and comprehensive changes to economic systems provided political cover for monetary system transformation that might otherwise have faced significant opposition from populations that valued privacy and financial autonomy. The integration of carbon credits, social credit scoring, and programmable currency restrictions was being presented as necessary for achieving emission reduction targets and social equity goals that enjoyed broad public support, even though the implementation methods would fundamentally alter the relationship between individuals and financial institutions. The timeline for full implementation had been accelerated by the development of artificial intelligence systems that could manage the computational complexity of monitoring and controlling millions of individual transaction patterns simultaneously. Without these AI capabilities, the kind of comprehensive economic management that was being planned would have been technically impossible. But advances in machine learning and data processing had made real-time economic control not just feasible, but relatively straightforward to implement once the basic digital infrastructure was operational. The reset was not a response to circumstances that emerged after 2020, but the implementation of a transformation that had been planned long before the pandemic provided the political and technical opportunity for deployment. The crisis-driven implementation ensured that the changes would be accepted as temporary emergency measures, even though the technical infrastructure was designed to be permanent and irreversible. The concept of too big to fail had always been a dangerous fiction, but by 2026, it was becoming clear that the largest financial institutions had grown beyond the point where traditional rescue mechanisms could be effective, creating a situation where their inevitable failure would require fundamentally different approaches to financial system management. The mathematics were becoming inescapable. The largest banks had balance sheets that exceeded the GDP of most countries, derivative exposures that dwarfed global money supply and interconnections that made their failure equivalent to the failure of the entire financial system. When institutions reach this scale, traditional bailout mechanisms become impossible, not because of political resistance, but because of practical limitations. No government, regardless of its monetary sovereignty, could absorb losses on the scale that would be required to keep these institutions operational during a systemic crisis. The derivative markets alone represented notional values exceeding $1 quadrillion globally, creating potential losses that could not be covered by any combination of government resources, central bank interventions, or international cooperation mechanisms. The interconnectedness had reached levels where the failure of any major institution would immediately trigger cascading failures throughout the global system. But the scale had grown to the point where preventing these failures was no longer mathematically possible. This was not a matter of political will or policy innovation. It was a structural problem that could not be solved within the existing framework of financial system organization. The regulatory responses that had been implemented after 2008 had actually made the problem worse by encouraging further consolidation and increasing the systemic importance of the largest institutions, while creating moral hazard that encouraged increasingly risky behavior. The stress tests and capital requirements that were supposed to ensure stability had been gamed and manipulated to show adequate reserves, while the underlying risk exposures continued to grow exponentially. The shadow banking system had expanded beyond regulatory oversight, creating credit and liquidity dependencies that were not captured in official financial stability assessments, but were critical for the continued operation of the regulated banking system. When the crisis reached critical levels, the choice would not be between saving these institutions and letting them fail, but between managing their failure through controlled demolition or allowing chaotic collapse that would destroy the entire global economy. The infrastructure for controlled demolition was already being prepared through the digital currency systems and direct payment mechanisms that could bypass traditional banking channels during the transition period. The new monetary infrastructure was not being designed to work alongside the existing banking system, but to replace it when the existing system became operationally impossible to maintain. The timeline for this transition was being driven not by policy preferences, but by the mathematical certainty that institutions operating with leverage ratios and derivative exposures at current levels could not survive the interest rate and credit conditions that were developing as debt dynamics reached unsustainable levels. The central bank digital currencies were not enhancements to the existing system, but the foundation for a replacement system that could operate independently of the institutional structures that were becoming too unstable to maintain. The coordination between central banks was focused on ensuring that when the transition became necessary, it could be implemented simultaneously across all major economies to prevent competitive devaluations, capital flight, and the kind of international monetary chaos that would amplify rather than contain the crisis. The controlled demolition would be presented as a rescue operation, with digital currencies positioned as the solution that allowed individuals and businesses to maintain access to payment systems and government services, even when traditional banks could no longer function reliably. The preservation of economic activity through direct digital payments would be emphasized, while the elimination of traditional banking privacy and autonomy would be presented as temporary security measures rather than permanent structural changes. The scale of the institutions involved meant that their failure would create both the necessity and the political justification for implementing the comprehensive monetary system transformation that was already technically ready for deployment. The specific events that would trigger the final phase of the monetary system transformation were not random crisis developments, but predictable consequences of mathematical processes that had been building momentum for over a decade, creating a convergence of pressures that would make dramatic intervention appear to be the only alternative to complete systemic collapse. The sovereign debt dynamics in major economies had reached the point where normal refinancing operations were becoming increasingly difficult and expensive, creating refinancing walls that would force governments to either dramatically reduce spending or find alternative financing mechanisms that bypassed traditional bond markets. The United States faced a particularly acute version of this problem because its debt service costs were consuming an ever-increasing share of federal revenues, while its ability to issue new debt was constrained by political dysfunction. Around debt ceiling increases and international concerns about the sustainability of dollar-denominated obligations, the corporate debt refinancing challenges were even more immediate and mathematically certain. Hundreds of billions of dollars in investment-grade corporate debt issued during the low-rate environment of the late 2010s and early 2020s would require refinancing at interest rates that many companies could not afford without dramatic restructuring or bankruptcy proceedings. The scale of these refinancing requirements meant that traditional credit markets would not have sufficient capacity to handle the demand, particularly in an environment where rising default rates made investors increasingly reluctant to extend credit to all but the most secure borrowers. The real estate markets in major economies were showing signs of the kind of stress that had preceded previous financial crises, but with debt levels and price distortions that exceeded anything seen in earlier cycles. Commercial real estate was particularly vulnerable because remote work patterns had permanently reduced demand for office space, while debt service costs had increased dramatically as interest rates rose from their artificial lows. The residential real estate markets faced similar pressures, as affordability had been destroyed by a combination of price appreciation and mortgage rate increases that made homeownership impossible for increasing segments of the population. The international monetary system was experiencing unprecedented stress as traditional currency relationships broke down under the pressure of divergent interest rates, capital flow reversals, and the increasing use of currency arrangements that bypassed dollar-denominated transactions. The BRICS initiatives and other alternative payment systems were not just competitive challenges to dollar dominance, but were creating fragmentation in international monetary arrangements that made traditional crisis management, through coordinated central bank action, increasingly difficult to organize and implement. The derivatives markets that had grown to extraordinary size and complexity during the low volatility environment of the previous decade were becoming increasingly unstable as interest rate volatility, credit stress, and currency fluctuations created margin calls and collateral requirements that many participants could not meet without forced liquidation of positions that would amplify rather than reduce market stress. The algorithmic trading systems and automated investment strategies that dominated modern financial markets were programmed based on historical relationships and correlations that were breaking down as multiple crisis factors converged simultaneously. When these systems began executing protective strategies simultaneously, They would create feedback loops that could accelerate market declines and liquidity crises beyond the capacity of traditional policy interventions to contain or reverse. The timing of these trigger events was not coincidental, but reflected the natural evolution of mathematical processes that had been set in motion by policy decisions made over the previous 15 years. The extended period of suppressed interest rates had created asset price bubbles, encouraged excessive leverage, and enabled debt accumulation patterns that could only be sustained as long as rates remained artificially low and credit remained easily available. The reversal of these conditions was not a policy mistake, but a mathematical necessity that would have occurred regardless of central bank preferences or political considerations. The digital currency infrastructure and alternative financial system architecture were positioned to be activated precisely when these predictable trigger events made continuation of the existing system operationally impossible, ensuring that the transition would appear to be a rescue operation rather than a planned replacement of monetary system fundamentals. The implementation of the new monetary system would solve the immediate crisis that justified its emergency deployment, but the long-term implications would extend far beyond financial system management into areas of social control and individual autonomy that were not being discussed in the technical literature or policy planning documents that describe the transition as a technological upgrade. The programmable nature of digital currencies would make possible levels of economic behavior modification that had never been achievable through traditional monetary policy tools, creating the foundation for social engineering on a scale that would make previous authoritarian systems appear primitive by comparison. Every transaction would generate data that could be analyzed not just for financial compliance, but for patterns of behavior, political preferences, social relationships, and individual psychology in ways that would make comprehensive social monitoring and control both technically feasible and economically efficient. The artificial intelligence systems that would be required to manage the computational complexity of universal transaction monitoring would develop capabilities for predicting and influencing individual behavior that would extend well beyond financial decision-making into all aspects of personal and social life. The integration of digital identity systems with programmable currency would create the technical infrastructure for social credit scoring that could be used to enforce compliance with social and political objectives through direct economic pressure rather than traditional legal penalties. The ability to restrict spending patterns, limit geographic mobility, control access to goods and services, and monitor personal relationships would give authorities unprecedented power to shape individual behavior according to policy objectives that could be modified and updated without legislative oversight or democratic input. The international coordination that was being established through digital currency interoperability agreements would create global monitoring and control capabilities that would operate beyond the jurisdiction of any individual government while being accountable to no democratic institution or constitutional limitation. The public-private partnerships that were managing the implementation of these systems would give multinational corporations direct access to individual transaction data and the ability to influence personal economic decisions through programmed restrictions and incentives that would serve corporate objectives while maintaining the appearance of regulatory oversight. The environmental and social objectives that were being embedded into the monetary system infrastructure would provide permanent justification for economic restrictions and behavior modification that could be continuously expanded without requiring additional legislative authorization or public approval. The climate change agenda would become a mechanism for controlling individual consumption patterns, travel behavior, and lifestyle choices through programmable currency restrictions that would be enforced automatically without human intervention or appeal processes. The health emergency powers that had been normalized during the pandemic would be integrated into the monetary system to enable automatic enforcement of public health measures, medical compliance requirements, and social distancing protocols through economic restrictions that could be activated and modified in real time based on changing health authority recommendations. The education and information systems would be restructured around digital platforms that could monitor and influence individual learning patterns, political opinions, and social relationships while providing personalized content designed to encourage compliance with system objectives rather than independent critical thinking or democratic participation. The employment and business systems would be integrated with the digital currency infrastructure to ensure that economic opportunity and professional advancement would depend on compliance with social and political requirements that could be monitored and enforced automatically through the transaction monitoring systems. The family and community relationships would be subject to analysis and influence through spending pattern monitoring, communication system integration, and social network analysis that would identify and discourage relationships and associations that were not consistent with system stability and control objectives. The resistance to these changes would be minimized through gradual implementation, crisis-driven justification, and the practical impossibility of participating in economic life without accepting the monitoring and control infrastructure that would be presented as necessary for security, efficiency, and social responsibility, rather than social control and political manipulation. The ultimate objective was not just monetary system control, but the creation of a social and economic environment where individual autonomy and democratic participation would become practically impossible, while maintaining the appearance of freedom and choice through carefully managed options and controlled information systems that would shape perception and behavior according to predetermined objectives that would never be explicitly announced or democratically approved. The mathematical certainty of what approaches in 2026 is not a matter of prediction, but arithmetic. When debt service costs exceed revenue growth, when refinancing becomes impossible at sustainable rates, when the largest financial institutions require resources that exceed government capacity to provide, the existing system stops functioning according to its own internal logic. What has been constructed in its place is not a solution to these problems, but a replacement that can operate independently of the dynamics that are destroying the current framework. The coordination is complete, the infrastructure is operational, the legal authorities are established, and the crisis triggers are already in motion. The transition will not require dramatic announcements or obvious policy changes, because the technical capabilities are designed to be activated through existing emergency powers when circumstances make continuation of current arrangements impossible. The public will experience this as rescue rather than replacement, as technological upgrade rather than fundamental transformation, as temporary crisis management rather than permanent systemic change. The patterns that matter are not the daily fluctuations in markets or political developments that capture attention, but the structural arrangements that determine what becomes possible when the current system reaches its mathematical limits. Those who understand these patterns will position themselves accordingly. Those who do not will discover that their financial autonomy, privacy, and economic choices have been transferred to systems that operate according to logic they never consented to and cannot opt out of. The reset is not coming. The reset is the recognition that the transition is already complete, waiting only for the moment when denying its existence becomes impossible. After that moment, the question will not be whether the changes are permanent, but whether anyone remembers what came before them clearly enough to recognize what has been lost.